Welcome back. So, we are still looking at Christmas past, and today we are up to the decade of the 1970s. So, we have some interesting things going on in the 70s. Part of it was the reasonable progression one might expect. 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. In some ways, though, it was a bit of a backlash. So we'll get into that when we come back. So as usual, we are starting off with the public displays, the commercial decorations, the municipal decorations. And we are back in the UK. Again, those double-decker buses are a great giveaway. And this is in London in the 1970s, and I believe this is Regent Street. Very impressive. At some point, I'm going to have to just gather pictures of the street decorations in London because they are really impressive, especially today with our modern lighting technology. So let's take a look at this. This is Mexico. Very different because, of course, the images are religious in nature. And in fact, there are images that we are not really accustomed to. For example, on the left-hand side, we've got the well, and that's not an ordinary part of our Christmas decorations, not even the nativity scenes. And that's very much what this is, with the manger and the donkey and so on and so forth. And this is New Jersey. I'm not sure where exactly in New Jersey this is, but I believe it's Jersey City. On the other hand, as I say, I'm not certain. And here we have gone off to Louisiana. This is a small town, so this isn't, New Orleans or Baton Rouge or anything very exciting, just a small town getting in the spirit. And this is Chicago. Now, of course, this is in daylight in the 70s, and it's necessary to see this one in daylight because the star of the show are these interesting little village facades all across the lower stories of this skyscraper. And when everything is lit up, you lose a lot of that. So, yeah, Chicago did a very interesting job of it. So let's start talking about what is uniquely 70s about Christmas in the 70s. And, you had to know this was coming. Of course, I'm going to do the Brady Bunch because that is the quintessential 1970s American family, and here they are all gathered in front of the tree because this is a Brady Bunch Christmas album cover. So, what can I tell you? Everything was merchandised. TV shows putting out Christmas albums. It was incredible, the level of merchandisation that we saw coming out of the 60s. However, we are going to see some serious changes because the 70s was a very interesting decade. Following all the social unrest of the 60s, there was some carryover the first couple of years of the 70s, but then there were changes. And there was a backlash, if you will. A lot of sociological factors contributed to that, but we are going to see the backlash, particularly as it impacted Christmas. So let's take a look at a few more pictures of real American families and not pretend Hollywood families. This is from a magazine, so it's probably not a real American family. This is undoubtedly just a bunch of actors and actresses together posing for a picture. One of the really great things about the 70s is it started to become diverse. We started to see non-white families. We also started to see unusual families. We were seeing extended families. We were seeing a lot that the very sanitized 50s and 60s sort of kept in the background. In this case, we have a lovely tree, but again, this is not a home. This is not real people. This is a magazine photo. No idea who these folks are. They are probably all professional actors or models. Now, here we go. This is, in fact, a real 1970s family. I'm sure you figured that out right away because of the matching striped outfits. Oh, yes, that was a 70s thing, and we are going to see more of this because this is the era when professional photography became inexpensive and, frankly, affordable for all people. So people were getting involved in posed photographs. This is a choreographed experience, but they were being done in photo studios. And I say this is somebody's home, but the simple truth is that might very well be a photo studio. When I look at the city reflected in that window, I've got to wonder if that is a real reflection or if this wasn't a studio photograph. This was just becoming really big. The studio largely responsible for this was one called Olin Mills, and they would do photographs. They would contract and do photographs at Sears. So you could go to Sears and you could get a Sears photograph, usually contracted out to Olin Mills, which was a private studio, but it operated on a massive scale nationwide. And in fact, as I say, you could get something like this and you might not know if this was taken in a well-decorated corner of a Sears store, a photography studio, or someone's actual home at Christmas. And it was like this weird Christmas tradition. If you don't believe me, go online and take a look at some of these. They usually come up under the category of dreadful photos from the 1970s because people are very embarrassed by this now, but it was a big thing back then. All right, at this point, we have real photographs. The little girl in front and center. Don't look too closely at her. She really reminds me of those little girls from The Shining. That's a scary little kid. This is a family at Christmas time, as you can see. The photograph is posed. No two ways around it. These people are all staring, well, not the creepy little girl. All the rest of them are staring straight at the camera. The little girl is looking off at the demon she has just conjured. The photographs were becoming a huge part of the Christmas celebration. They would be shared with family and friends. They would be thrown together in albums. But this was the period when virtually everyone could afford either professional photographs or their own camera and camera equipment. Also, notice this tree. What we are seeing is well-decorated Christmas trees. People are paying attention. Now, I'm not going to say this is the best decorated tree I have seen, but it is so far above the average tree of the 50s and 60s that you can absolutely tell this is becoming a thing people are planning for and working at. It's becoming almost like a representation of their family. And they know they are going to be sharing these photographs. Here. Now, of course, we can see this young lady is posing. Very 70s. Goodness, look at that hair and look at that pantsuit. Oh my. Once again, we have the tree. The tree it's a nice tree, and I cannot tell if it's a real tree or an artificial tree. Based on the fact that this is 1970s, I'm going to venture to guess that it is an artificial tree. Loaded with presents. We've just got presents everywhere here. And again, the photos are going to be saved for posterity, so they are putting an effort into this scene. This is a little girl surrounded by so many goodies, and the child looks like somebody just told her she was going to have to sit in the corner for an hour. This is a kid who does not look happy. We've got this wonderful tree. Obviously, this is an artificial tree, one of that flocked snow-covery types of trees. And we're showing off the abundance once again. All these toys, and just one little itty bitty child in the middle of it, and one child who doesn't look very happy either. Well, here is our tree all by itself, and this is a real tree, and I like that. The more of these artificial trees I'm seeing, the more I am coming to appreciate the asymmetry and just sort of natural vibe you get from the real tree. All covered with silver tinsel. Once again, plenty of presents under the tree. The television, and the television is ubiquitous. You will see a television peeking out in most of these Christmas photos. Once again, we have an artificial tree here. And from the looks of it, this tree is in some kind of little alcove beyond the piano. Very hard to tell. Again, presents everywhere. The presents are under the piano as well as under the tree because they just don't have enough room for all this stuff. Wonderful image, very, very authentic. And I do love the picture of the little girl on top of the piano. And here we have another coordinated outfit Christmas picture. Everybody is matching in their wonderful little gingham outfits, and even Dad's tie is matching these gingham vests and jumpers and whatever. My goodness. Our tree is minimally decorated in the background. Perhaps that's because they didn't want anything to attract from the outfits. I don't know. But this could also mean that this is a photograph taken in a photography studio where they would have kept a minimal tree, and we can't see any presents or anything underneath it, but they would have kept a minimal tree so as not to detract from the people they were photographing. So I don't know which way this one is going to slice down. Is this their own tree, or is this a studio tree behind them? But this was indeed, as you can see, a 70s thing. And here we go. We have two little girls in front of a Christmas tree, definitely in a home, definitely a natural tree. They've got their toys open in front of them. But please notice, because we're going to see a lot more of this, and I will point it out to you as we go. The children have stuffed animals. The children finally have what we would consider to be safe, age-appropriate toys. They don't have, little Lincoln logs they can poke their eyes out with, or little electrical toys they can electrocute themselves with. There's no soda bottle anywhere in sight. This is starting to look like a child-friendly Christmas for the first time. And here. Now, you had to know I could not resist this. Yes, this is a 1970s family doing their 1970s thing. Mom's a drinking. Dad's got something he's smoking in his hand. I'm not inquiring too closely because look at that man. There's no telling what's in that cigarette of his. And once again, the children fortunately have age appropriate toys, soft, plushy animals, a Raggedy Ann doll, little things that they can't get hurt on. So we are seeing that as a major change coming out of the 60s. They have a nice natural tree in the background. They appear to have the mandatory wood paneling. Well, it's faux wood paneling. That was, again, a huge thing in the 70s. This is one of those pictures. If I didn't tell you it was 1970s, I wouldn't have to. You'd get that all by yourself. And here is another photograph. We don't have a Christmas tree in this one. What we have is the wall of Christmas cards and the large extended family all gathered together for this photograph. Judging by the relative ages of those children, I am going to assume it is mom and dad, their two grown children, the spouses of those grown children, and the grandchildren, because we really do seem to have children clustered a little too closely in age for it to all be from one set of parents. So that is my guess on this photograph, but we are absolutely having some changes here. The focus is starting to become a little different. It's more on the people and a little less on the stuff. And now let's take a look at Christmas cards, because I've tried to show you cards from each decade, and we see a major change when we go into the 70s. This is a very traditional scene. There's very little about this that would have said 1970s, with the exception of the quality of the image. And let's take a look at another one. This is Santa Claus. Again, very little other than the quality of the image that would have said 1970s. In the 1970s, printing techniques had improved dramatically, and as a consequence, you could get high quality, beautifully printed cards at very low prices. Originally, the Christmas cards were nothing but postcards. They were on flimsy paper, and they were like those little paper valentines we used to get and give when we were children. They were designed to be disposable. You would get it, you would read it, you would throw it away. But people started collecting their Christmas cards. They became little keepsakes of Christmas. And the printing industry, which had a number of changes, and by the way, you're not going to like this, but this is the truth. Many of our major technological advances have come from times of war. And after the Korean conflict, and frankly, early in the 70s, we were still in Vietnam. But the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, we were seeing the benefits of that in terms of our technological advances. So we had some very good Christmas cards. Christmas cards that were of a quality that we would have expected to pay much more for, but we were getting them at very, very reasonable prices. So when we look at the cards from the 70s, the sudden jump in quality should be enough to tell us what decade we're in. And this one, of course, you know, this is late 70s. This is one of those, how can you not know? This is another thing that came out in the 70s. We started to see trademarked images on cards. In this case, it's Star Wars, because in the late 70s, everything was Star Wars. And as time went on, we saw more and more trademarked images from television, from motion pictures, from toys and other commercial products making their way into Christmas. And this is just a few of the many, many Christmas cards featuring Star Wars images and other images as well. And because we have also simultaneously kept an eye on the Coca-Cola Santa Claus Christmas relationship, I thought I would show you this. We talked about the fact that Matchbox cars and Hot Wheel cars and Scale X tricks in the UK were like the huge thing, these little racing cars. By the 1970s, Coca-Cola and Santa Claus were just capitalizing on this and putting out their own little line of these die-cast cars. And a lot of people saved these. Coke memorabilia in the 70s started to become a huge thing. This is an image from an old Coke ad. Now, the image itself is not old. It's like a recreated image because all of these old Coca-Cola advertising pieces were resurfacing in the 1970s. Now, when I say resurfacing, no, they were not actually antiques. What was happening is they were being reprinted. Coca-Cola trays were being remade. Coca-Cola ads were being reprinted, and they were being sold. Now, in the thrifting videos, we have spoken about this on several occasions, because the problem is now we are 50 years later, and this old Coke memorabilia that was brand spanking new in the 70s, they just had images that were 50 years older than that, from the 1900s, the 1920s. They are now making their way back out into the marketplace. And they do legitimately have some age to them. That age, however, is only 50 years, not 100 years. So it is an area of collectibles, but boy, do you have to be very, very careful with it. And here, do you remember this? I'd like to teach the world to sing. Coke was actually making the pop charts with their Coca-Cola jingles. Incredible. But Coke, by the 1970s, had become such an integral part of Christmas that it just plain wasn't Christmas without some sort of push from the Coke advertisers. So let's go over to Christmas ornaments, because in the 70s, we have something that's really fun. Now, these are beaded ornaments. They are styrofoam balls, and they have little plastic baubles pinned into them. You could get these in kits and just sit around the house and make your own beautiful ornaments. And this was quite a thing. I made ornaments like this back in the 70s. I had a lot of friends who did. We just sort of turned it into this wonderful pre-Christmas craft project. Let's take a look at some more of these. They could be very, very beautiful. And you can get the ones made in the 70s today, or here, take a look at this one. You can get new ones. You can probably still get the kits somewhere. What was happening in the 70s, and I alluded to this when we started this video, is there was a backlash against the excesses of the 60s. Keep in mind, there was so much social unrest, and usually when people go through a period of social unrest, they seek out a calm time afterward. And this happened in the 70s. And one of the the most telling indicators is for the first 5 years of the 70s, 1970 through 1975, the number one show on television was All in the Family. And All in the Family was still stuck in that 1960s generational polarization. Liberals versus conservatives. Archie Bunker, the conservative, and his son-in-law, Mike Stivic, otherwise known as Meathead, the liberal, and that back and forth. And by the mid-70s, our tastes had changed. For the remainder of the decade, the number one spot was held alternatively by Happy Days and its spin-off series, Laverne and Shirley. Two television shows set in the 1950s when we were actively desirous of going back to the less complicated good old days. And that is a normal reaction. We see this in decorative items. When we go through a time of crisis, following that, we will see a desire to go back to a time of stability. And as I said, with decorative items, we see a great deal of that. In particular, the kinds of furniture and paintings that were popular in the era between the two world wars, when people were craving peace and stability. So that's something that we were seeing in the 70s. This, as I say, a backlash of sorts. We are tired of the conflict. We want peace. And we saw the 1950s as the peaceful decade when we were all on the same page. So we cast back. Now, how that applies to Christmas is, remember when we looked at the Christmas baubles of the 60s and the plastic, and they were beautiful, but they were cheap. There was no two ways around it. They were cheap, they were disposable. We suddenly seemed to have this desire for one-of-a-kind decorations, for decorations that did not look cheap, decorations that were not disposable. Baubles like this were going to be carefully packed away. And in fact, in the 1970s, you could go into stores and buy boxes for your Christmas ornaments. These boxes with little dividers, and you could put the ornaments in and they would stay safe until next Christmas. Why? Because this probably represented, I don't know, 5 or 10 hours of mommy's time making these beautiful ornaments. So, yes, we were looking for something different, something diametrically opposed to those values of the 60s, that sort of slash and burn. Honestly, it really does remind me of like Sweden agriculture. Slash and burn, give me what I want now, and to heck with the consequences. That very disposable mentality of the 60s. In the 70s, we're moving away from that. So, let's take a look at toys. One of the top toy manufacturers from the 1970s was Fisher-Price. They were making high-quality, virtually indestructible educational toys. This is a little medical set. They had little farms, and they had little airports, and Fisher-Price had just about everything. They were safe toys. They were toys. These were toys that were going to be passed from one kid to the little brother or sister, and maybe to the nieces and nephews next. They were durable. They were high quality. Yes, they were a little more expensive than the made-in-Japan toys we had in the 1960s, but at this point, we absolutely had a generation that was looking for this quality. Another thing that came out, and this is 70s version of merchandising. Isis, this is one of many action figures. Action figures were, in effect, dolls, but they were called action figures because they were available for boys as well as girls. And I simply chose this one because some of you may remember this was actually a television show. And we were getting these little figures from TV or movies, and they were the dolls now. They were very, very popular. Some action figures really dominated the market. For example, these. By the end of the 70s, these were the action figures the kids wanted. They wanted Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and, yeah, I can actually do the whole list of them. I swear I can. This is what they wanted. They wanted toys from their favorite movies, from their favorite television shows, and the toy manufacturers were giving them to them. Now, these were not safe toys. The little guns and detachable parts could be extremely dangerous to toddlers. But for children who are old enough, these were definitely a step up from what they were used to. They were hard plastic, they were durable, they were not going to fall apart in 2 or 3 weeks. So, overall, definitely an improvement, not for the toddlers. And this, I don't know if any of you remember this. This is an Atari console, and this is the Pong game, the first video game. Basically, by the end of the 70s, video games were taking over as the hot toys. Totally changed the face of Christmas for kids, because by the time we got into the 80s, those video games had better be under the tree or mom and dad were in the doghouse. They came about in the 70s, gained popularity toward the end of the decade. A lot of people think, oh, they had video games in the early 70s. No, it wasn't until the end of the decade that they really started to become popular. They were not inexpensive, but you didn't have to mortgage the house to get them either. And for most kids, by the time we went into the 80s, that one game controller under the tree was worth a dozen cans of silly putty. And here is what they looked like. Those are game cartridges in the back. This is what they looked like by the end of the decade. By the time we got to like 79, this is it. It wasn't just one game. Pong, by the way, was just one game. You could get this video console, and then you could go out and for $10 or $15 get individual games. So once you made the initial investment, and most parents were smart, they'd go to grandma and grandpa and say, you buy the console. Then they could just fill the wish list for $10 or $15 per game. Good thinking. This is another one that came out. And it's related to the video game. These are handheld electronic games. In many ways, they were very much the first readily available video games, very inexpensive, and people would just get addicted to these things. I can remember in college going into class where people would be pulling them out of their back pockets, sitting in the back of the class, playing these foolish games. Yes, that was the big thing. And here's another one. This was a short-term memory enhancement game. The machine would play a series of notes and flashing lights, and then you would replicate that. And this was a terrific educational toy because, as I say, short-term memory enhancement, very, very good. But because of the different tones and the bright lights, it was completely engaging for the children. They were learning without realizing they were learning. But again, this is the 70s. We want more for our kids. We want our kids to be safe, to be entertained, and to be educated in some way by their toys. But it's also the 70s, so we're crazy. And here is one of the top selling toys of the decade. Now, I'm calling it a toy because, frankly, everybody else does. I look at this as a gag gift. Not exactly a toy, but I'm not sure what else I would call it. So maybe I have to call it a toy. Yes, a pet rock. The inventor of the pet rock, these, by the way, sold for $3.95, I think, for a rock. Honestly, what were we thinking? The guy who came up with this made approximately $1 off each one of those he sold. And at a point, I believe it was 1975, these came out shortly before Christmas, he was selling 100,000 of these a day. So this guy was making $100,000 a day selling people rocks. What a country. Now, honestly, I have to say it's hard to top that. So we are going to go out on the pet rock. But let me just sum up by saying that by the time we hit the 70s, we were more aware as consumers. We were actually starting to worry about letting the Christmas toys harm our children. The little kids growing up in the 1970s were so much safer than their older brothers and sisters in the 1960s. We were starting to look more long-term in our Christmas purchases. We were starting to prioritize at least the images of family in Christmas. So we're seeing some backlash against the incredible crass commercialism of the 60s. And to my mind, that's a good thing. So we're going to take a look at a slideshow on the way out. I will see you all next time. Have a terrific day.